Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jessica Reynolds, and I'm Director of Office of Downtown Development here at the Georgia Department of Community Affairs. And we're so glad to have you join us for our next webinar in our monthly installment. So today we have a very special guest, and actually this was a parting present from Lee Burns before she departed our office. She said, Jessica, you have to bring in Tom. And so we reached out to Tom Little. He's the Director of Historic Preservation at Surber, Barber, Choate, and Hertlein Architects. And we're going to be talking about something that we haven't ever covered before. We're going to be talking about codes. And you've got some excellent case studies for us, and I know we talked a little bit before we were on air about what we're going to be seeing today, and I'm excited. But all right, Tom, I'm gonna turn this over to you and let you drive and give us a little bit of information about you and yourself and your background and your history before we dive in, just so people can have an understanding of who you are a little bit and where you come from.
Thank you, Jessica. I work at Surber, Barber, Choate, and Hertlein Architects. I've been there for about 20 some odd years, and my experience has largely been with adaptive use projects and historic preservation projects. This webinar has given me a chance to catch a breath and look at building codes from a different viewpoint. I encounter them every day in my work because obviously our buildings have to comply with applicable building codes. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about what building codes are. We're going to talk a little bit about how modern building codes came about, how we use the building codes, and some tips on what you might look for while you're using them, and how these codes accommodate existing and historic buildings in different ways. And I'm going to end it with a handful of case studies from work that I've done over the past 15 or 20 years that will illustrate some of these concepts we talk about.
Awesome. And I think this is great because we have a lot of managers that come in and we have to deal with this kind of stuff, and we don't necessarily have a background or expertise in this, and a lot of times, you know, we're relying on somebody else to kind of help guide us through this process. So I think having a better understanding of how this all works will just make our managers more effective in their jobs.
Great. I might add that I don't pretend to be an expert at building codes, but I do have to use them every day in my work. So over the 30 some odd years, I've become very familiar with building codes, and especially how building codes work with existing buildings.
Awesome. All right.
Well, what is a building code? I have a Webster's definition here on the screen. I could read that whole thing for you, but basically the bottom line is that building codes were created to standardize construction issues related to public health and safety. In Georgia, the DCA is the gatekeeper to our mandatory codes adopted by the DCA. There's a list here on the screen. I am going to focus on the International Building Code with Georgia amendments that focuses on buildings. I'm not going to get into these other codes because I'm not familiar with them, because I don't deal with those. Our engineers do.
And one of the interesting things a lot of people probably don't know who are listening is that actually the building codes is in our division. So we share, you know, a hallway basically with our planning and, you know, environmental management folks. They're in our division as well as the building codes. So we're very familiar with these guys and what they do.
It's interesting. There are other states, and their Department of Community Affairs also administer the building codes, which I find kind of interesting.
Yep.
I came from Tennessee, and I don't believe it's set up that way in Tennessee. So.
Yeah, Main Street's kind of similar. You know, I would say for the most part they're housed in like community affairs or economic development on the state level, but every now and then you find it, you know, in kind of hidden in different places. So
one point to be made here before we move on, there are Georgia amendments to these codes.
Okay.
So you need to be aware of those because they do change some of the basic things that are in the codes.
Okay.
Elevators, et cetera, are a little bit different. Well, how did building codes come about? I looked into the history of building codes, which actually I found pretty fascinating. It turns out that the first history of building codes we have is almost 4,000 years ago. And it was during the eye for eye, tooth for a tooth period So at that point, the law said that if a building fell down and killed or hurt someone, the builder would either be killed, or if an arm was lost, they would cut their arm.
Literal eye for an eye, tooth for tooth.
They're not quite that strict anymore. But what happened in the United States, their building codes really came about towards the late 19th, early 20th century, and they responded to two major factors in the United States. There were major fires in urban areas, and later there were smaller disasters or smaller incidents where people died that fed further refinement of the building codes. These big city events include the Great Chicago Fire. The city was built mostly of wood at that time. The fire spread quickly. This is the one where the cow, apparently, supposedly kicked up the lamb. It killed 250 people, and about a third of the city was destroyed in 1871. In Boston in 1872, at the time, Boston took pride in thinking their city was mostly fireproof. Well, the fire proved them wrong. The fire spread quickly. It destroyed over 60 acres of Boston. The big thing here is that the fire pumps could not reach above the third floor of the buildings. So after this fire, Boston strengthened their building codes and inspection procedures. And they also upgraded firefighting procedures as well, which was a big deal with early building codes. In 1909, the San Francisco fire was a result of a 7.9 magnitude earthquake that ruptured water lines and gas lines. Fires broke out throughout the city due to the gas lines. And the bad thing that happened is that the firefighters were using dynamite to create fire breaks, so the fire wouldn't jump from building to building. Yeah. And when they used the dynamite, that exploded further because of the broken gas lines.
Oh, yeah.
So the fire burned for 2 days. 450 people died. This was a big, it led to some thought about building codes nationwide. Then we get into these individual disasters, the individual events. The Triangle Waste Company in New York in 1911. It was a sweatshop. The stairwells were locked. There were no fire alarms. There were flimsy fire escapes. The ladders for the firefighters were too short to reach the space. All of this contributed to 146 deaths. This was a key moment in building codes in the United States because codes came about that required fireproofing, sprinkler systems, and it led to the creation of the NFPA 101, which we'll call the Life Safety Code as we get through the presentation, and I'll talk a little bit more about codes. Another disaster was the Rhythm Club disaster in Natchez, Mississippi in 1940. The decor of the club, it was a nightclub, the decor was flammable. They used Spanish moss as part of the decor, and when it caught on fire, it created methane gas.
Oh my gosh.
There was only one means of egress from the club. The door swung into the building, and the windows were locked up, so people wouldn't crawl into the window, through the windows to get into the club. 209 people died. Major code revisions addressed the number of fire exits required, and they required doors, exits to swing out in assembly buildings. And here in Georgia, the Winnicott Hotel fire, which you may be familiar with, occurred in 1946. It was considered a fireproof hotel. The elevators and stairs were located near the center of the building. The hallways were covered with burlap and wallpaper, part of the decor. But it did not have a fire alarm. All the finishes were flammable. There was no fire suppression system, and there were no additional fire escapes other than the central stair. Killed 120 people. Wow. This led to revised codes that address the locations of fire exits, requirement for fire suppression or sprinklers, and fire alarms, and operable transoms were banned from high-rise buildings at that time. That also led to some scientific studies about the flammability of finishes in buildings, which are a part of the building code. There's been many others. Some that you may or may not remember were the Beverly Hills Supper Club that killed 167 people in 1977. That was in Miami. And in 1980, the MGM Grand Hotel fire with flammable finishes actually contributed to the death of 84 people.
And that's, I mean, that's modern day. If you
That's
think about
very
it, I mean,
modern day.
1980, that seems way too, way too close.
There are still disasters that occur that require going back and modifying the codes.
Absolutely.
So they're a living document.
Yeah, I'm even thinking of like in recent, you know, history, like in the past decade, hearing stuff about clubs, you know, still that being an issue with bands having some kind of pyrotechnics or something like that, and you know, one thing leads to another, and
that specific event, it resulted in change of finish requirements, and also the code started to address the use of pyrotechnics on the stage more.
Wow.
Interesting. Well, all of this led to the development of national model codes. And in 1915, there were 3 groups created, which was and they each published a national code. We had the Boca National Building Code, we had the Uniform Building Code, and the Southern Building Code. Well, this went along for several decades, and in the 80s and 90s, states and cities recognized the value of having a national standard building code. So there would be some predictability and things would be standardized across the United States. So in the 1990s, these 3 groups merged, creating the International Code Council. They created a national model building code, first published in 2000, was the International Building Code. And that is the building code that we use in the state of Georgia now.
Okay.
When I first started, I was using the Southern Building Code. In Georgia, we use a bunch of different versions of the IBC. There's residential, there's building, there's fire suppression, plumbing, electrical. Again, we're going to focus on the building codes here. Okay. One key thing to note, and you'll see on the screen, you see the life safety code and the building code. The Georgia amendments replace sections of the International Building Code that deal with means of egress and life safety with sections from the NFPA Life Safety Code.
Are they more strict?
They're not more strict, but they deal more, they just deal with things a little bit more differently. They don't deal with technical issues as much.
Okay.
It's more about getting out of the building type things.
Got it.
So how do these things work and how do we use them? I just think of it as a big book. So it was refreshing for me to step back and look at them this way and to look at the basic concepts of how these codes work. And there are several basic concepts, but the key basic concepts of how these building codes work are occupancy type, construction type, floor area, building height, exits and egress, and building separations. We could go further, but I'm not going to drill down further because we have limited time. Occupancy type is the first thing that controls the rest of everything in the building codes. So once you identify your occupancy type, it defines everything else you do.
So like whether it's commercial or residential, something like that.
That's correct.
Okay.
And these occupancy classifications determine the type of construction you can use, the size of the building, how tall it can be, how many floors you have. And the classifications go from very basic ones like residential all the way up to hazardous materials. So they cover the
full gamut.
The full gamut. The concept that I think is interesting to think about here is that residential occupancy assumes that the occupants are familiar with their surroundings.
Okay.
So therefore, the restrictions on flammability and where the doors are and the number of exits and such are less restrictive than an assembly occupancy, which assumes the people are not familiar with their surroundings, and they assume that there would be a panic in a bad event like a fire or a bomb. So the restrictions on egress and construction type and how big a space can be and how many exits you need are much stricter for an assembly occupancy.
It makes sense, though, if you think about it in that context. Absolutely.
Sure. And going next to the construction type, construction types are how the building is constructed. The IBC has a range from 1 to 5, which is high to low.
Okay.
The higher resistance, which would be a 1, gives longer time for a building to be evacuated, for the firefighters to come in and put the fire out. So therefore, if it's an assembly or a higher level occupancy, it's going to be easier if your building is made out of concrete or steel that's encased in concrete. It's going to be harder to make that work if it's a wood frame building. And you may run into that with change of occupancy, where there might be a house that becomes a restaurant or something like that. So you may run across that, especially dealing with existing.
And we see that a lot, I think, kind of in the Main Street world. We see a lot of you have these residential areas that surround your historic downtown, and as those original commercial spaces become occupied, you see this transition from what was once a house to now maybe an office, or maybe that becomes a dental office or an attorney's office or something like that. But these residential neighborhoods almost kind of start to get eaten up with turning to commercial or office and institution, something like that.
And I'll talk a little bit more about occupancy change in a few minutes. I probably should have put that as a bullet point here, but we'll get to it in a minute. Also, floor area, building heights, and floors are defined by occupancy classification and construction type. And if you have a certain type of construction type, which we just touched on, you may have to make your space smaller. You may not be able to have as many people in the space. And the big point to carry home here is that you get a lot of credit for having an automatic sprinkler system, which really does save lives, especially with assembly in public buildings.
Absolutely.
And then exit and egress has basically three components. An exit access, which is how you get to the exit. The exit, which is which is a door or a hallway that leads to a door. And the exit discharge is where you actually leave the building and go to a public way.
Okay.
And the codes have specific requirements for all components, doors, hardware, sizes, and distances between exits. And it has an impact on floor plans and how your building is laid out. So it's an important thing, especially if you're dealing with an existing building.
Absolutely.
And then building separations, they're created with fire-rated partitions. They can be made out of brick, concrete block, or gypsum wallboard. They're typically UL-rated assemblies, which you'll see a reference to if you spend much time in the construction industry.
What's UL-rated mean?
Underwriter's Laboratory.
Okay.
And they have a big lab that
that tests
all these fire stuff. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. You'll see pictures of fire going up the side of a wall construction. They actually test it. So, and if you have two different types of occupancies in one structure, you may need to put a fire separation between them.
Okay.
And one thing to keep in mind, if you have a very large building, and we'll look at one of those in the case studies, you may be able to get more stuff in a building if you split it into different fire compartments by using fire separation. So if you had a giant shopping mall and you split it up into 3 compartments, you might be able to make it work, whereas the codes might not allow you to make it one big space.
Yeah, so interesting.
Using the codes is pretty straightforward. It's basically looking at what we just talked about. This list is how the step-by-step how the IBC recommends you start looking at a project. This goes for an existing, historic, or new construction project. The first thing is to identify the occupancy type, then move on to the type of construction. Look at the location on the property. I didn't touch on that earlier, but codes address how many windows you can have depending on how far away from a lot line you are, etc. Allowable floor area, we've talked about that. Height and number of stories. And then you get into the nitty-gritty. There are specific occupancy requirements for hazardous, for assembly, that are specific technical things that deal with these specific occupancies. Look at the specific requirements of that construction type. It'll address the thickness of concrete or the type of brick or concrete you use. And then the egress requirements that we touched on earlier. It's pretty straightforward. I have been doing this for years and I don't even think about it. So once you've done it for a while, it becomes second nature. But I think if you see how this works, you might be able to talk to architects or building code officials a little bit easier about how this
Awesome.
procedure works.
That's what it's all about.
And the key thing to remember, and the IBC reiterates this too, is that you should not remember the details of the code because they're subject to change each time a new issue comes out. What's key to remember are these basic building block concepts because they tend not to change. If they do change, they evolve over decades instead of every 2 or 3 years when a new version of the code comes out. So now I'll talk a little bit about how these codes work with existing and historic buildings. Are we doing it on time? Great.
Oh, yeah, we're great on time.
Perfect. Existing and historic buildings are unique. The NFPA and the IBC both have requirements specifically dealing with existing buildings.
Okay.
As I touched on earlier, if the occupancy changes in a building, it's going to trigger a review whether you're actually physically changing anything to the building or not.
Okay. So even if it's a restaurant leaving and a restaurant coming in, it's still going to be under review.
That is not a change in occupancy because it goes from a restaurant, which is an assembly occupancy, to another assembly occupancy.
Okay.
If it went from a business occupancy to a restaurant occupancy, then it would be subject to review.
Okay.
And you would have to get a building permit or at least have it reviewed by the authorities.
Okay, cool.
And the key thing to remember, if a building is officially considered historic, then they need not meet new construction requirements when they're not judged to constitute a safety hazard by the authorities. So, and AHJ means authority having jurisdiction. I'm sorry I put that lingo in there. But to be considered historic, it means that it's listed on the National Register, it's eligible to be on the National Register, or it's listed on a state or local register of historic places. So that's pretty lenient.
Do you have like an example of maybe a requirement that may not need to be met if it's considered a historic property?
Well, the easiest one I can think of are the energy codes, which we're not really talking about here, but the energy codes, basically you're relieved of complying with anything that to do with the energy codes. If you're
probably because you're going to have a hard time meeting them. But
yeah, that's another subject. But yes, that's but there are things like that.
Okay.
So
and I think that's a good thing to know.
Yes.
You know, and especially, you know, I remember coming in when I first started, and you know, having our codes people tell us, oh, well, no, you know, it has to be like everything else, you know, and but I'm like, we're talking about historic properties, you know, they're not the same, you know, so I think it's good to know that there's a little bit of leeway, or things can be a little bit different depending on if the property is historic.
And just as an aside, I think the reason that these codes do integrate this is because the preservation community has demanded that they address historic properties. Otherwise, they might not.
Yeah.
So, one thing to keep in mind, it's related to what we're talking about, is that accessibility requirements are, you have to take care of that whether you're historic or not. Those apply to everything.
Got it.
The other thing to keep in mind is that if you are required to comply with something in your existing building, then if you have an engineered solution or an alternative solution, you can discuss that with the authorities, and they have the ability by law to let you do that if they deem it safe.
Okay.
So
yeah, that's good to know.
And in Georgia, our codes specifically deal with historic buildings. They define what a historic building is, which I just discussed. But there is a unique thing in Georgia. Not every state has this. There's a thing called a landmark museum building here in Georgia.
Okay.
And if it's a historic building which is used as an exhibit of itself, basically, and it's open for at least 12 days a year as a museum, then you can get quite a bit of relief, and you don't really have to comply with the building codes. I have a case study where we'll look at that in a few minutes.
Okay, great.
But it doesn't mean that it has to be used just as a museum. It can be an office for the 365 days a year, but you just have to have it open for public viewing. So
interesting.
It comes in handy sometimes. So I'm going to show you some projects that we've worked on in my office that deal with some of these issues. They may raise more questions than answers, but I'll talk a little bit about each. The Commons at the Imperial is a historic hotel building here in Atlanta. It was built in 1910. It's a local landmark building, and it's listed on the National Register. It was vacant through the 1980s until the early 90s, when it was first renovated to become apartments. Mm-hmm. I actually worked on that in the 1990s when I was working at a different firm. And then in 2014, I got to work on the project again, where we did a second upgrade to bring it up to higher level and provide apartments for special needs tenants, chronically homeless people.
Yeah. Wow.
So I think key things on this project were that we sat down with the code enforcement authorities early in the project, and talked about the specific issues here. We installed an automatic sprinkler system, which gave us a lot of credit. And the change of occupancy from hotel to residential is a very easy change, because you have to have corridors, you have to have 2 stairs, you have to have rated corridor walls. So that was fairly easy. We were allowed to reuse the existing mid-century stairs that had been installed after the Winnecoff fire, and we're also able to reuse the 1990s era stairs. We were given a variance for elevator cab sizes, so we could use the historic elevator cab and shaft.
Okay.
We couldn't fit a full-size stretcher in it.
Yeah.
And all of this was done with limited impact on the historic fabric.
Cool.
And I might add that it leveraged historic tax credits as well.
Awesome. Yep, definitely.
This was a very large project. I talked about large projects earlier in our discussion. You may be familiar with the project. It's here in the old 4th Ward neighborhood of Atlanta. It was built between 1929 and served as a distribution center for Sears, Roebuck and Company. At some point in the 90s, the city of Atlanta gained ownership of the building. It became City Hall East.
Yep, that's what I remember it as.
And it was used as a mix of offices and storage until this project came about that was finished in 2016. It's cast-in-place concrete, masonry exterior walls, and it includes over 1,800,000 square feet of space, so it's huge. The project that was completed in 2016 split the building up into residential, office, and retail uses, and it added significant amounts of parking to support those uses.
Absolutely.
This was a tax credit project as well. It's considered one of the largest ever. So. The challenges here were basically the change of occupancy, the mixed occupancy, the large floor areas, the existing stairs and elevators, and the fact that we had to do a structural analysis for seismic requirements.
Okay.
Going back to the change in occupancy, the big problem here is that we wanted to create basically a shopping mall in the middle of this building, which has a whole thing of code-related issues with it, egress, smoke evacuation, etc. And the other mixed occupancy issue is that when you have residential over a parking garage next to a shopping mall, there are a lot of issues that come with those building separations that we had to deal with. This is the mall space, the market hall under construction, when the hole was cut in the floor and the steel was added.
And this is interesting because I'm thinking, you know, in our downtowns, you know, we may have a building that was once a bank, a 5-story bank or something like that, and what do you do once this leaves, because it's hard to find one use for it. So a lot of times we think mixed use, which would mean, you know, to us, commercial on bottom and some residential component on top. And whenever I think about these projects, the first thing I'm always thinking about is how are we going to fund it, you know? How are you going to make the dollars work? What kind of tax credits can we use? That sort of stuff. But you know, I don't always think about the whole codes component, but that's huge. I mean, it's huge as far as financially making the project cash flow, how much you're going to have to put into these type of renovations and meeting these requirements in order to make this project work, you know.
And on a project of this scale, when you layer on the review requirements of the tax credit programs, it gets very complex.
Because you're still trying to meet that threshold so you can, be eligible for those as well as,
Well, all of this give and take that we've talked about makes these things work. So it's a cumbersome system sometimes, but generally it works.
Interesting.
So the way we solved those problems, or those problems were solved, is that we had great support from the City of Atlanta, the State of Georgia, and the National Park Service. The NPS and the State of Georgia were involved as a result of the tax incentive programs. What we had to do to deal with smoke evacuation from the mall is to do an engineering study that proved that we had sufficient draw to draw the smoke out of the shopping mall component.
Okay.
That's what this blue and green diagram you're looking at is part of. We went in and we modified the stairs, not significantly, so that we had upgraded handrails. There were a few stairs that we had to modify. We upgraded the existing automatic sprinkler system. We had to install exhaust systems at the parking areas, pressurize the stairways to keep smoke from invading the stairs in case of fire. And all of this was done, again, with very limited impact on the historic features of the building. So I'm going to go to a smaller scale now. This is Thompson Depot in Thompson, Georgia. It was an iced tea project, so it's has a little different flavor than the other projects. It was built between 1860 and 1908. The part we worked on was the part you see in front of you, which was actually the passenger depot that was built in 1908. A bicentennial era project turned the depot into meeting spaces and created in the passenger depot a city-county tourism office. The 2015 renovations that were part of the iced tea project not only worked on the streetscape and addressed some physical shortcomings of the building. It created an office suite and 2 new meeting rooms, which there was a big need for in Thompson.
I've actually had a meeting in this meeting room. It's a beautiful place. It's very well done.
It was great. These people were wonderful to work with. And the DOT was wonderful to work with.
That's great. That's good to know.
There was a back and forth review process, which obviously took a lot of time, but
yeah, that's great to know.
Great to work with.
And that can be intimidating too, knowing, I think whenever you're thinking whether it's the tax credits or stuff like that, if DOT has to review it, it's kind of one of those things you're always like, oh gosh, what's that going to be like? So to know that people have had good experiences with that and that good stuff can come from it, is just encouraging.
Well, the good thing about these projects that deal with these kind of difficult issues with historic buildings is that the DNR also has some oversight over these projects as well.
That's awesome.
So the challenge is we didn't have any documentation. There was a sprinkler system that we wanted to reuse, but there was no documentation, so we had to put a new one in. And I think the big take-home here is that when we started the project, there was a local building inspector who had been deputized, more or less, by the fire marshal's office to do building inspections. Well, that person disappeared about halfway through the construction process. So it shifted back to the central office in Atlanta of the fire marshal.
Wow.
And that raised some questions. The fire marshal had additional questions that had not been raised by the local reviewer. They weren't significant, but it meant that we had to go back and analyze how we were taking care of some fire separations, and we did address those issues. And we had to address some issues with the sprinkler system installation. But that was very interesting, and needless to say, there was a little bit of hand wringing as a result.
Yes, of course.
But again, we had relief from the energy codes because it was a historic building. We had to upgrade the fire separation between our construction and the existing construction that we weren't touching as part of this project. We installed a new automatic sprinkler system in the new construction part. We upgraded doors, door hardware, exterior walkways and ramps as part of the streetscape project. And we added a lift that created a full accessible connection between our work and the adjacent assembly space. All of this was done with limited impact on historic features. And I might add, in the plan that you see in front of you, the work we did is the light gray square to the left. And when we first started on the project, this
Okay,
part here,
so this area.
that area. First started on the project, we were quite ambitious and did a feasibility study actually before they applied for ICE-T money that encompassed the whole complex.
Mm-hmm.
But when we actually got into it and realized the scope of work, we were more limited in the scope of work.
Got it.
But overall, a great project. So I hope this information was helpful.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Actually, I have another case study. How about that?
One more.
One more. This is an iconic building in Atlanta. You're probably familiar with it. It was built actually completed in 1904. It took quite a while to build it. It was donated to the state of Georgia in 1929.
Mm-hmm.
For a while, it was used as the state archives.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was later adapted for use for the Georgia Trust offices. That happened in 1984. And that was alongside museum and special events uses that worked with the Georgia Trust.
Absolutely.
And then in 2009, we addressed some accessibility and egress issues with the building. There were several challenges that we had to work with. There was no accessible route to the building from either the street or the existing parking. There was no room or a reasonable location for a standard size code compliant elevator to be put in the building. Mm-hmm. And there were no accessible toilets basically anywhere in the building. And there was no room to do it on the upper floors without damage to the historic features of the building.
That's a lot of challenges.
It was, and this was we started with a master plan and worked through all of this, and this was kind of the end of the projects that were implemented as part of that. The key things here is that it was a landmark museum building, like we talked about before, which allowed us to install a Lula elevator instead of a full-sized elevator.
Okay.
And a Lula elevator is intended generally for residential use, not for public use, because it's small, very slow moving, and we had to get a variance for that, not because of the Lula elevator, but because the elevator rise or run was actually about 2 inches more than Lula elevators are allowed to be. So we got a variance for that. The state helped us with that. We added accessible parking at the rear of the house, created an accessible route into the basement from that, added accessible toilet facilities in the basement, and future plans include an accessible route from the street. And again, there was very limited impact on the historic features of the building. Given that this was a state project, even though it's located in the city of Atlanta, the state had oversight. So we actually reviewed through the state fire marshal's office instead of the city of Atlanta. These other projects, Ponce City Market and the Imperial, were both reviewed by the city of Atlanta because they have the authority, they were given the authority by the state to enforce the state building codes.
So here with Rotal, we're talking about with that special elevator and stuff. All those kind of exceptions and things were made possible because of that landmark museum, like occupancy designation. What's the word I'm looking for?
It facilitated that. We could have probably done it without the landmark museum building designation because it is a historic building. It's listed on the National Register. So we probably could have done most of these things without that. But since it's open as a museum, basically most days of the week, we would easily comply with the landmark museum building qualifications. So that's it in a nutshell. I appreciate the time. And this was a very, very, very high-level overview of building codes and how they're implemented. And if you're not dealing with them every day, there is a book that I would recommend you look at. It's this book called Building Codes Illustrated, A Guide to Understanding the International Building Code. This one in particular covers the 2006, but it was illustrated by Francis Ching, who has illustrated architecture books for years. But it explains these big picture concepts in easy to understand language. So it might be a good reference book to keep if you're not dealing with it every day like an architect does.
And we can put a link to that in our video when we upload it. I have a couple questions before we kind of conclude. So when we're looking at these codes and everything on the state level, basically my understanding is that kind of sets the bar. So can local government be more strict than the state, or are they required to just do what the state does?
If they are given the authority to enforce codes, they can certainly be stricter than the fire marshal would be. They cannot be more lenient, obviously, but they could be more strict if they find a situation that they find unsafe.
Is there a way for someone to kind of contest that, or could they contest that on a state level if their local government is more strict and it's kind of inhibiting or prohibiting them from doing something?
I have never run into that situation, so I'm not sure how the legal ins and outs of that would work. But certainly if you get a decision by a local authority, I would encourage you, if it's not working for you, to go back and sit down with them, because they have the authority to let you comply with codes in different ways that are not spelled out in the codes. So if you need extra exit signs or you need more emergency lights than the codes specify to make something safe, then sometimes things like that will work.
Would you, so I'm thinking of when it comes to like renovating historic properties and trying to get them up to code, do you have, like, off the top of your head, like, usually, like, these are the top 3 common challenges that people are facing when it comes to bringing a building up to code?
I think the big thing that people deal with largely are accessibility requirements, which are both a building code issue and they're also a federal law issue with the ADA. We do the physical compliance with the ADA, but there are a lot of issues with that are operational that building owners have to deal with. But accessibility is a big issue. If you're dealing with an existing building that might not be historic, then energy code issues may be an issue.
Okay.
I know we could be relieved of that at Ponce City Market, but I use it as an example because we were going after LEED certification, which is a higher level of energy performance. And we built an energy model, or at least our engineers did, built an energy model of the whole building and determined that changing out the glass and glazing was not a good value because it didn't make that much difference in energy use. Putting a more roof insulation on and improving the efficiency of the lighting and the air conditioning was more efficient.
And that's so interesting, because I think everybody always thinks, go to the windows first, you know, everything, you know, but to know that there's other ways to address some of those things.
Windows are easy to rip out and replace, but if you think about it, especially in an older masonry building, they are a very small square foot area of the whole wall area.
Absolutely.
So they may not have as much impact as you think
it does. Makes sense. So, what about compliance with, like, fire suppression? And can that be challenging just for the sheer cost of it?
It can be challenging for the cost, and it can be challenging because you may end up changing some of the appearance of a space. If it's a very sensitive space, sometimes we just expose it so it doesn't damage the historic building. But in general, we've been able to work through that pretty well. But if you sprinkler a building, it buys you so much freedom to do other things. If you're doing a project of any size, it's definitely worth looking at sprinklering a building. Absolutely. And it saves lives too. It saves buildings.
Well, and it saves, not only the building you're in, but also sometimes your neighbor's building and so on and so on. We had a couple years back, we had 3 or 4 downtowns that had massive fires in them, and sometimes it was just a standalone building, and other times, like in Clarksville, it affected multiple properties. You know, so it's one of those things that doesn't just affect you. Sometimes it affects your neighbors and everybody around you as well. Well, thank you so much for coming. I learned a lot today. You know, it's always nice to sit there and be able to feel like I can take something away and you know, apply it to what we're doing out in the field. And what we're going to do is include your contact information. And is it okay if people reach out to you if they have follow-up questions regarding our presentation today?
That's absolutely fine.
Awesome.
I would appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was great speaking with you, and I appreciate you coming.
Thank you.